Hi, and welcome to the Couchlit Book Club. I'm Lauren.
I'm Lena.
And we would love for you to kick back and relax with us while we chat everything reading. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we're recording on, the Yagara and Turrbal people of the Meanjin Nation. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So in today's episode, we will be discussing all things non-fiction. We'll be analysing some of our favourite non-fiction reads and breaking down exactly what we think makes for good non-fiction. To state the obvious, non-fiction books are stories that are informative and factual and typically aim to present topics objectively. Now, this doesn't always mean that the story is the exact truth, as no one and nothing can ever be truly unbiased. And like I said over on our Instagram, I think non-fiction is a bit like coriander. People either eat that shit up or they hate it. But I think non-fiction can get a pretty bad rap sometimes, and I don't think it's fair to write off a whole genre like that. Personally, my enjoyment of a book is less about the genre and more about whether it crafts a good narrative. And a lot of you guys told us over on our Instagram that you need a bit of spice in a non-fiction story, which I think is totally fair. So Vicky said that self-help doesn't work for her unless the message is embedded into the story itself. Otherwise, it's just a fact on a page that doesn't quite register. Now, I couldn't agree more with this, and I think I have the same gripe with coffee table books. They're often just facts on a page dressed up with a fun cover as a conversation starter. Ugh, yeah, yawn. And Nisha also isn't the biggest fan of self-help. She said she only likes to read self-help books if she's in the mood, otherwise she feels like a failure. And honestly, that's a little bit too relatable, so we're not going to touch on that one. But overall, majority of you all said you were fans of non-fiction, which we love to hear. What I think is exciting is that you can learn something from fiction, just as you can escape with a well-crafted non-fiction. And I think there's sometimes the mindset that fiction is only for fluffy escapism, and non-fiction only serves the purpose of education, which for many seems dull. But in reality, what I think a good non-fiction should do is use narrative and creative storytelling to share something factual that may or may not teach you something, it doesn't matter. But yeah, it really comes down to that narrative, that storytelling. Otherwise, who cares, right? But there's also so much variety within the non-fiction genre. You've got memoirs and autobiographies, self-help, history, science, philosophy, true crime, like the list goes on.
Yeah, so some of the most famous non-fiction books out there include like The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind by Yuval Noah Harari, Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, and Atomic Habits by James Clear. Now, I'd actually be quite surprised if you haven't heard of most of these titles, especially Meditations by Marcus Aurelius.
Oh, really? That is the only one in your list that I have never heard of.
Perhaps I just live in my own little bubble of history and philosophy, because everyone in my little circle knows about it.
Yeah, you did do a history degree.
I did. Well, either way, I haven't read it yet. Okay, I own it, but I haven't read it yet. So everyone who has read it around me says that it's worth the read, but it is a bit philosophical, so it could also be a bit big. Regardless, it has been immensely popular since its publication in 1559. The book is a first-hand record of 2nd century Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius's everyday life and thoughts, and a commentary on Stoic philosophy, which he actually wrote to guide his own self-improvement, which is eerily similar to the self-help books we read today. So just continuing this little history lesson, the genre has been around ever since ancient civilizations needed to record and explain their laws. The earliest works of non-fiction can be traced back to the ancient Bronze Age, where ancient Akkadian literature was already producing the Babylonian Chronicles, a history of the lives of kings, philosophers, and the workings of the empire by 740 BCE. Through the centuries, subgenres were established. Histories branched off into biographies, autobiographies, memoirs, and books about current affairs. Science and nature writing broke away from religious texts, and the teaching guides of ancient Egypt have led to the self-help we know today. So, self-help. I don't necessarily read a lot of it, but I definitely read a lot of books where I can maybe get some self-help from, like between the lines. And Lauren, I know you do as well. So what are your thoughts on the self-help / well-being books that we do read today as a society?
Yeah, I think when I hear self-help books, when I see the self-help section in a bookstore, I kind of avoid it, or like I roll my eyes. I think any book that has self-help undertones is going to be much more effective in getting its message across than a quote-unquote self-help book. And that's because they often feel like really shoving the message down your throat, like, it just feels a bit much. I think it's a lot more natural, or a lot more individualized when it's naturally weaved throughout a story, because self-help books as well can feel a bit like they're trying to give you a prescription to like this ideal self in whatever manner. And I think, again, when it's weaved into, for example, a memoir or an autobiography, it's someone's personal experiences, you can take what you want and use that to help yourself in whatever aspect of life you choose. Does that make sense?
Yeah, which is exactly why I have not picked up Atomic Habits by James Clear, because it's always on that top, the bestseller list and shelves. And it's like, oh, I don't really want to read it. And I don't really want to be told how to make or break these great habits. You know what I mean?
It's like, who is to say that that's the solution for everyone? And self-help books just feel a bit entitled, you know?
Yeah, no, I agree. But, a book like The Space Between by the girls who do the Shameless podcast, I really enjoyed that book because I don't necessarily think it is marketed as self-help, but I actually took a lot of self-help from that as someone who was at university looking to get into the media industry. And actually a lot of my experiences when I first got into the industry was so similar to theirs. And thank God I had actually read their book, because I was able to apply a lot of what they had said and apply or even just contemplate what their thoughts were during that same or very similar experience to my experience. And I actually came out of it knowing when to maybe say no to a job offer, or even say no to a potential story, or even when to realize I needed to take a step back from the industry I was in. And it was because of their book. So I guess that's also another great example of, it may not be marketed as self-help, but it can definitely work out as a self-help book. And even well-being. I would even put that as a well-being book as well.
I do think that's a really interesting example that you chose. And I'm really happy that you got something out of it, because I actually was so disappointed by that book. I really like the Shameless Girls. I think they're great. So yeah, but that, I don't know, I got nothing out of it. I was really disappointed. I kind of just felt like, okay, so what? Give me, I felt I wanted more. It kind of didn't really tell me, but I don't know, maybe I went in with a different mindset, and again, I was after something different. And yeah, I guess maybe what you were chasing, they had all the answers. But yeah, I've spoken to a few other people with the same kind of opinion, and I am in no means hating on them, because I love Michelle and Zara. I think they're great. But yeah, I didn't like that one at all. I thought it was so average.
Yeah, well, I highlighted and annotated the shit out of it. So I actually do want to read it as well now as a 24-year-old rather than the 21-year-old I was, and see if my opinions and views have changed.
But now I want to chat about one of my favourite non-fiction books. So this is a memoir by Dolly Alderton. You've probably heard of it. It's called Everything I Know About Love. There's since been a really popular TV show made about it, which is pretty great, actually. It's a pretty good adaptation, and it's really interesting. You don't often see adaptations from non-fiction. It's usually from fiction. Not always. Definitely not always. You do see it, but I feel like with this type of non-fiction, it's not typically adapted, but it has been adapted really well.
And it's usually like a documentary style biography.
And this is very much not. This is very much fun, let's go, woo girls, party time.
Yeah,
and it's great.
Yeah.
Okay, but anyway, this book, I've read it twice now, and even though I enjoyed it on the first read, it actually grew on me even more the second time, and I think maybe that's because I was a bit older. But yeah, reading it as a similar age to Dolly's self in the book, I actually didn't heavily identify with as many of her experiences as I originally thought I would. Her 20s could not have been more different to mine. She was going on midnight adventures, catching trains to different cities. She obviously lives in the UK, so a bit easier to do that there than here. But still, hers was so chaotic, and my early 20s were slightly disrupted by COVID, and the fact that I'm not as much of a free spirit as her, my type A personality does love to get the better of me sometimes, but anyway, this certainly didn't lessen my enjoyment, because the themes, they felt really familiar and personal in a really odd but comforting way. And if you've read the book, you know that Dolly's personal recount of her life experiences are extremely entertaining, even if you can't relate. I was thoroughly entertained. That was so much of my enjoyment for this is great. But also, I think the book was meant to encourage growth and self-reflection, after you've lived and made mistakes in your 20s. But there were still times where I felt myself feeling really judgmental towards her, kind of insinuating that, I wouldn't make the same silly mistakes, and I would definitely react so much better in that situation, which That's so ridiculous. Like, that's so embarrassing that I thought that, because that's so not true. I have done some stupid shit. Like, that's just not true at all. But I think maybe that was the point, to like get you to kind of reflect on yourself as well. Like, in the moment I'm like, oh, no. But then I'm like, oh, wait, hold a damn minute.
My anxious self has already reflected on all my fuck-ups and stupid behaviour. I don't think I need to read it.
Sorry, you've already self-actualized to a point of no return. You're now perfect.
Oh yeah, I am. 18 to 23 were my years for fuck ups. I'm now perfect. I don't fuck up anymore.
You're the optimal human being.
Oh
now.
yeah.
Well, if anything, this book will make you feel good about yourself then. But yeah, the personal recount of stories and life experiences also really made me empathize for Dolly, you know, in the same way I'd empathize for anyone else experiencing anything. Like, she really makes you want to care, and you do care. Like, you feel like she's your friend when you're reading this. But at the same time, it also welcomed critique towards the more often chaotic and questionable parts of navigating your 20s. You know, it's a memoir after all. I think I felt at times like I was watching my friend, like, going through all these, or like reading or listening to my friend going through all these massive life changes and just being like, no, stop, like, let me help, like, don't do that. Which is a bit lame. I felt like the mum in the situation. Like, anyway. I really felt as though Dolly was able to capture the themes of unavoidable chaos of young adulthood, and it was her use of personal experiences that helped reshape my understanding of how this experience is different for everyone. You know, that there are so many different ways to fuck up in your 20s, and even though I didn't relate to, you know, what she was doing, I related to what she was going through different stupid things that I was doing. It's a really simple message that really made an impact on me when I was reading this at, say, 22. You know, frightened, confused, pissed off, and everything else going on, a concoction of emotions. Yeah, it really hit me where I wanted. And also, it changed my perspective on memoirs. Because even the name memoir kind of gives me the ick, if I'm being honest. And I know that's stupid. But this memoir made me understand, you know, what it is that I seek in non-fiction stories, especially memoirs or autobiographies. And, you know, that's a good narrative. A good narrative is what I need in any story, and this memoir of hers nails that.
Now, before we move on, Lauren, I do have one question. Do you think Dolly Alderton's book, Everything I Know About Love, actually will hold up in the future?
That's a great question. Oh, I kind of think yes. Actually, I don't know, because a lot of it, I think about this all the time, like the social media generation. As much as I grew up with a bit of social media, it's nowhere like what, you know, kids today, I say with my fucking cane. It's nothing like what kids today are experiencing growing up on social media. Like, she is literally on her flip phone. Like, it's also very UK related, but I don't think that makes too much of a difference. I think it could hold up, because at the end of the day, it's stories that happened. Like, you know what I think? It's like classic teen movies. Like, Mean Girls, Angus Thongs and Perfect Snoggings. Those movies, they hold up today.
Yeah. And like American Pie. Even though there was really not much technology involved, I still feel like when you watch American Pie, you go, oh my God, yes.
Oh my
Cringe.
God.
I definitely went through that same experience, or like, oh,
the only thing
God.
that doesn't hold up in American Pie is the anti-PC-ness, but
okay.
Who cares? We can let that slide.
Look, it's early 2000s.
So true.
That was the thing.
So true. But no, that's a really good question. I do think that this could hold up. And I think to anyone who hasn't read it, if you just feel, I don't know, a bit meh, read this book.
Moving on now. Many of you mentioned on Instagram that you love reading about history. And if you haven't figured it out already, I'm a little bit of a slut for some history.
A little bit.
Yeah, okay, maybe a major slut. Anyway, it's no surprise then that my favourite subgenre of nonfiction is history, specifically Australian colonial history.
That's so niche.
Now, there is a lot of politics surrounding this era, which I do acknowledge, but that is not a discussion for today's episode. What does draw me in, though, to Australian colonial history is the grisliness, hardship, and just all-round resilient nature of the people that lived in that time. Like, it was a shit time to live. Sorry. Let's just like not sugarcoat it. And Katie Gilchrist, the author, she really paints this picture in Sydney, New South Wales in her book Murder, Misadventure and Miserable Ends. Now, this book is not for the faint-hearted. It explores 19th century Sydney as a treacherous place of seedy streets and rowdy hotels, crowded wharves and dangerous industries. Murder was rife, there was very little safety regulations that resulted in accidental deaths, and there was a lot of desperation that led to despicable crimes like infanticide. And Gilchrist does not shy away from this. She uses the records of the coroner's inquest of the time to tell the personal stories of those who fell victim to the grisly streets of Sydney. Now, I read this book back in 2019. I hadn't really read much books written in the Australian landscape at all, let alone history. So I was pretty brand new, and it was my gateway to Australian colonial history and my love for it. So my review may be a little bit biased, but nonetheless, I think it is a fantastic read. And for anyone who is interested in dipping their toes into the world of crime and just everyday life at a time where, poverty was really big, people didn't have good access to education. We were still very much in the, aftermath, or even still in colonization of Australia. So I think what Gilchrist does so well is taking that dry and boring information from the coroner's inquests and turning it into a digestible narrative that connects the reader with the subject. I still to this day vividly remember the stories that Gilchrist shares in this book. I remember where I was. I remember the words on the page. I remember the stories that really stood out to me. And I won't actually bring them up because I don't want to spoil anything for you guys. But I was enlightened. I was absolutely educated by this book, because there were so many topics that in today's modern world, you would never think that something was criminalized. You would never think that someone would be so desperate to commit such a horrible crime. Or you think, oh, why wouldn't you have more street sense? Well, back then you had a horse and cart. You had trams at the same time. And people, I just think there was less emphasis on being safe. Yeah. So I think that Gilchrist's ability to take these dry facts, I could not imagine a coroner's inquest being very fun to read. Okay?
Oh.
Sounds boring as fuck. So I think it's such an art that she was able to take that information and be able to turn it into a narrative that the everyday reader can actually digest. Not just digest, but even feel like they're in the story. Yeah, like you feel like you're transported to the dirty streets of Sydney. But I also think that it is such an art because it is so easy to have a book read like a textbook when so much of the story is based on facts. And I actually think this is simply because it's just easier. It's just the easier option to state the facts, to not be creative with it. But also, I don't think we're taught much on how to take facts and be creative with it during school or during university, at least in my experience.
No, I agree. I really agree. And I think... we both studied journalism, and I really don't feel like it was until the very end of our degree when we were kind of encouraged to go beyond, that classic news writing style, and maybe, as much as you have to remain unbiased, put a bit more of a storytelling flair in there, like write a bit more of a, an article, something to chew on, as opposed to, like a feature story, as opposed to, this is what happened, here's the facts. Like, so many fantastic pieces of journalism that, award-winning journalism, they craft a story, and it's excellent storytelling that wins them those awards, because, that's what gets people to care. That's what creates action. That's what, we're not really taught how to do that. And especially if you work a job that doesn't really encourage that type of thing, you get into these habits of only writing what you need, and sometimes it just doesn't get the message across.
Yeah, so to conclude the discussion on this book, I do just want to say that I think it is a great introductory read for 19th century Sydney. I just remember being so enlightened by this book, and the fact it doesn't shy away from the grisly details, for me, really makes it. Because I also think in modern times, we tend to forget that up until recently, death used to be in everyday life. People didn't have a hospital to go and die in. They died in homes. They also sometimes, unfortunately, died in the streets, and their bodies would stay there until the coroner could come and collect them. And that was everyday normal life. But today, death is private. It mostly happens in hospitals or nursing homes because we have that end of life care. And thanks to modern medicine as well, many more people can overcome illness and disease that only 100 years ago would have taken their life.
Sponsored by modern medicine. No, you're right though. You're 100% right. I think the book sounds really interesting. I feel like it would give a really great sense of perspective.
Yeah.
Sounds fascinating.
It does make me not want to be in that time. It makes me very thankful that I, was born in the 21st century with everything that we have access to. And I also think this book, you still have empathy for those who committed these horrible crimes, because back then a life was very much about survival. And when you're in survival mode, you are pushed to your limits, and everyone's limits are different. If you can handle subject matters that are quite deep like that, like trigger warning for suicide, murder, domestic violence, child abuse, that's all in here.
Yeah.
But they were real life stories, and I'm glad that Katie Gilchrist was able to bring those stories to life.
Speaking of grisly murders, let's talk about our July book club reads. So this month we read The Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman. Now, I have an opinion or two about this. I have an opinion about everything. So, of course, I have my 2 cents to share. Lena, do you want to cover this one off first? Because I think your review might be a bit more chipper than mine.
Okay, I gave this 3.5 stars immediately after reading it. And then
to clarify, 3.5 out of 5.
Oh, yeah, sorry, 3.5 out of 5 stars, yes. But when recording this episode, I have dropped my star rating down to 3.
Oh, yes.
Because I've had a few weeks to ponder. Because I read this very quickly. I read this within the first 4 days of July. So I've had some weeks to like think about it. I could not read it physically.
Yeah.
I could not read it physically. It wasn't necessarily the writing style. It was the narration. I could not picture really fun, happy-go-lucky, interesting, older people in their 80s narrating this book. Okay? I struggled to get that voice in my head. So I decided to talk to my mum. My mum says she was loving the book, and she said she was laughing out loud. And I was like, well, I haven't laughed out loud yet. Why haven't I laughed out loud? Anyway, she was reading audiobook or listening to the audiobook. So I decided to change it up, and thank God I did, because I would have DNF'd it otherwise. And I was thinking, oh my God, imagine if this put me in a reading slump. And we chose this book just after speaking about reading slumps.
That would have been a bit too perfect.
Yeah. Either way, the audiobook changed my mind, and I really did enjoy it. And it was because it's a full cast of voices. So every single character has a different person narrating them. And these people do such a great narration. Like, I was instantly transported to this, into this story, and I no longer thought of it as, just another old lady narrating. It was like, oh wow, like this older lady actually is very chipper, very bubbly, and is a real go-getter. And I can hear that coming through the narration of the voice. So that really changed my perspective. I also enjoyed that there were short chapters. That really helped me as well.
Yeah.
However, I did find some of the characters annoying, and I found that up until maybe the 75% mark was like, this is okay.
Yeah.
This is okay. But around that 75% mark, there were just twists and twists and twists and twists. And I'm apparently too stupid to figure out whodunit stories. So I actually found these twists quite like, oh, shocking. Okay. And then I could not put it down. I sped through the last bit of this book so quickly.
Interesting. I mean, I am giving this a 2-star.
You're so harsh, Lauren.
No, I finished reading this 20 minutes before we started recording because I could not get through it. I struggled so much to read this because it was a bit boring. And like you said, the first 75% was a chore to get through. Sorry, that doesn't make a very good book for me, does it? 75%.
Talking about British accent that you just did. You also said it was too British for you.
Yeah.
Give me the Brits. I love the Brits.
Yeah, so do I. But no, I can't even form a thought about this book yet. I mean, I have and I will, but you know what I mean. No one knows what I mean. Okay, I think, I didn't like the writing style. It was just a bit get to the point, Richard. Come on, get to the point. Didn't like that. I didn't like the lack of world building. Now, I'm not a big fantasy reader, which I know is massive world building, but also just a little bit, I couldn't really picture the retirement village where they're at. I couldn't picture the police station, which is another major scene. I couldn't picture the town. I couldn't picture anything. The only thing I could picture was the cemetery, which if you've read it is one major scene. One major area spoken and used throughout the book. That was the only place I could picture.
I also struggled to picture the characters before the audiobook.
Interesting, yeah. Well, I read this physically as well. I didn't listen to the audiobook. Read it physically. And I think I really enjoyed a lot of the characters, except for one. She was pretty smug and felt like she was above the law, annoyed me a little bit. But I think otherwise the character development was pretty strong for the most part. So, and that saved it for me. But and it didn't take itself too seriously. I like the short chapters, I like the twists. But yeah, it took too long to get there. And I think, yeah, it just was a little boring for me. I didn't love it. The twists weren't exciting enough for me. The characters weren't. I don't know. I don't know what I wanted more here, but this just was not for me. I will say one thing I did really like was that the author didn't infantilize any of the older characters. This can be really common in media, and it really irks me. You know, I shouldn't have to say this. It's common sense. Older people are people too who've lived a life.
Yeah.
But I think often people infantilize them, and it's just really like, ugh, ick.
Yeah, like these characters, they had some pretty awesome careers that were definitely not shied away from. They were given in detail, and they still influenced the way they went about their life in their older years in this retirement village, which is the whole entire point behind this Thursday Murder Club. And I really appreciated that.
Yeah, everyone had a personality. It was no like, oh, fuddy-duddy older person does this. If anything, they played into tropes for comedy. Yeah. That was where there was comedic purposes, was when they were playing into tropes, and that was actually quite good. Actually, speaking of comedy, my favourite line of the whole book came literally within the last 2 pages. This is my favourite line of the whole book. Okay. I like it when men cry. Not too much, but this was just right. I don't know why it made me laugh. I think I was like just so happy to know that this book was coming to an end. And then I read that line and I was like, nice.
Yeah. Now, I also just want to say, like, on the book not taking itself too seriously, I had to suspend my disbelief, which I mentioned in the first episode I struggled to do. But I managed to do it, and that's where I started to really enjoy this book, which also happened to be around that 75% mark where the book itself did actually pick up. Yeah, I just had to see past the fact that these things would never actually happen in real life. This book would never actually happen in real life, okay?
It was very whimsical.
It was very whimsical. That's a really good way to put it.
Yeah.
And everyone dies.
Yeah.
And everyone could be a suspect.
So many people die. And like, sorry, we know it's set in a retirement home. If you haven't read it, I just want to preface this with, people aren't just like, no, everyone's not just dropping dead in a retirement home. Like, we're talking about murders.
Murders.
Yeah. Grisly murders.
Murders that happen, you know, around the vicinity of the retirement village, but also like elsewhere. And they interconnect. It's really wild.
I thought it was a bit tropey too. It's like, all the murders were connected.
Yeah.
Of course they were. Of course they were. But I also think Richard Osman has such a knack for being able to make this big web. Yeah.
And actually at the end wrap it all up.
Yeah, because it did make sense, the wrap up. It did make sense. I was just like, who cares?
Yeah.
Because it took so long to get there that I was like, I don't care anymore.
I would call this an airport read. Oh my God, an airport read. If you're at the airport, you just need something to read. Yeah. That is what this is.
Yeah, I will say, speaking of whimsical, I feel like that's a common theme with what I don't like. I read a book called Anxious People, and I didn't like it for the same reason. It was so whimsical, and it was just like wishy-washy. Not for me.
Moving on now to our August book club selection. Thank you to everyone who got involved in our Instagram poll. So the selection is Raw Dog, The Naked Truth About Hot Dogs by Jamie Loftus. So it is part investigation into the cultural and culinary significance of hot dogs and part travelogue documenting a cross-country road trip researching the landscape of American hot dogs as they're served today. Poor people created hot dogs. Rich people found a way to charge $15 for hot dogs. They're high culture. They're high culture, they're low culture. They're sports food, they're hangover food, and they're deeply American, despite having no basis whatsoever in America's indigenous food traditions. You can love them, you can hate them. You cut them up and put them in a bowl of macaroni and cheese. Disgusting. But you can't avoid the great American hot dog.
Oh, I manage.
You manage?
Yeah, hate hot dogs.
Yeah, I can't eat them either.
But I like the sound of this book.
It does sound really cool, doesn't it? I actually I've had this on my radar for a long time, and I'm very excited to read it. I'm hoping it's going to be a fun read, but it does actually have some really serious history to the hot dog. There's slavery involved. there's gentrification involved.
Gentrification.
So yeah, I think we'll get some really interesting discussions out of this, and we really hope you guys enjoy it. Now, we did do some research into how to get a hold of this book. It is a little hard to get a hold of it physically, but you can absolutely get your hands on an ebook or audiobook version on Spotify, Google Play Books, and many other platforms. Just check them out. So yeah, exciting times ahead. We'll have to eat some hot dogs on next episode.
Oh, I don't think so.
What about sausage snag?
Oh yeah, we can do the Aussie version of a hot dog. We can go to Bunnings beforehand.
Yeah, Bunnings snack.
Anyway, just a reminder to keep up to date with what's going on over on our Instagram. We'll have more polls coming up, more reviews, more chance to chat, and yeah, we're hoping to do some more interactive stuff around the book club. We want to chat to you about books because, you know, as interesting as we are, you know, we want to hear your opinions too.
Yes.
Read up, bitches!